Hi everyone, welcome to this module on database searching. We'll be searching the database Pubmed and we'll be taking a look at the Medline EBSCO database. I wanted to start by talking about the differences between the resources. Sometimes they're confused and people think they're the same thing, and they're very close. But to start off though, PubMed is a free resource. It's a product of the National Center of Biotechnology Information under the U.S. National Library of Medicine, located at the National Institute of Health. So you will always have this to your availability. But the thing you need to know is that it's mostly abstracts, not full text. If there's a full text freely available, you'll see it there, but for the most part you're just going to get the abstract and have to find another way of obtaining the full text. PubMed indexes Medline, that's the biomedical journal literature, and it's the same content that you'll find in the Medline EBSCO, but it also indexes additional journals beyond that scope in the life sciences and some online books. PubMed is about 98% Medline. The thing about Medline EBSCO is that it's a subscription database, and you'll only have access to it as long as you have access to a subscription. You have one here at Misericordia. Perhaps you'll have one at your workplace. I don't know. That's why I want you to become familiar with PubMed. The thing about Medline EBSCO, being that it's a subscription, we pay for access to much of the full text. So if you find an article out on PubMed while you're here or have access, you can always go into the journal finder to see if you can find the full text of the article here. So keep that in mind. Also, if you're familiar with the EBSCO interface, then it's very easy to transfer to another EBSCO interface. Yes, they will each have their own unique limiters. Yes, they will have their own unique subject headings. And as long as you know that, you're fine. But the basic mechanics of working within the database are the same. We're going to start with the clinical scenario. In perimenopausal women with abnormal uterine bleeding, is a partial hysterectomy more effective than endometrial ablation at decreasing AUB symptoms? We're looking at a therapy question, and our population would be perimenopausal women with abnormal uterine bleeding. The intervention is partial hysterectomy. The comparison is an endometrial ablation. And the outcome we'd hope to have would be those decreased AUB symptoms. Since I don't know much about abnormal uterine bleeding, I look to my background sources. So I'm selecting the One Search tab, databases A through Z, and I scroll down to U for up to date. I enter my phrase, and when I begin to read, and I suggest that you read it in its entirety, but when I begin to read, I notice that there's an issue surrounding the terminology that has been used. And so I'm particularly interested in that since I search on keywords. And so I link out to the information about that. And I understand that it's a very poorly defined term, and so they sought to rectify this. And as I read through, it highlights terms that were commonly used, not clearly defined. So what I'm taking from this is that I may see this in the literature, and I will think of using these as keywords, but also knowing that abnormal uterine bleeding is the preferred term. So it's part of the history, and it's something that will impact my search. Now I'm going to jump out to PubMed. It's easy enough to get to the PubMed homepage. Just type in pubmed.gov. However, since you have access to Misericordia subscriptions, in order to do that, go to the Misericordia homepage. Go to One Search, Databases A through Z, and select PubMed from our list. This will make it easy for you to link out to the full text if we have it. I'm at the PubMed homepage and I'm going to explore automatic term mapping. Automatic term mapping is a unique feature of this database where it looks to map your terms to the appropriate subject heading. In this case, the subject headings used in Medline are called mesh headings. So it looks to match to mesh, and it also searches that term with your keyword terms to produce a result set. Let's start with our first concept, abnormal uterine bleeding. Notice when I entered the terms, I did not put double quotations as a phrase. I did not use any Boolean operators. And we're going to see how the database mapped. If you scroll down and look at the search details box, and you can click on see more for a fuller view. And here we can see what the database did to our terms. It did not map to a mesh heading for abnormal uterine bleeding. And we saw that that's the terminology that's currently being used. It did map to the term uterine hemorrhage, and it ended it in with abnormal. Then it also looked for uterine and hemorrhage as a search, or uterine hemorrhage as a phrase, or uterine and bleeding, or uterine bleeding as a phrase. So it used the terms we entered as well as the terms that it mapped to. Because I didn't get an exact match on my terminology for abnormal uterine bleeding, I wanted to explore it further in mesh. In CINAHL, we went to the CINAHL headings in the menu bar. To get to mesh in PubMed, use the drop-down and then select your heading from the alphabetical listing. Now we're no longer going to be searching PubMed, we'll be searching mesh. This is the mesh index, and abnormal uterine bleeding matches directly to metrorrhagia. We can read the definition, and that's the scope note. We can look at the subheadings and select them just as we did in CINAHL. If we want to see the scope notes for the subheadings, click on Subheadings. In CINAHL, we could have made a topic a major topic. We can do the same in mesh. I generally do not do that on my first go-round. In CINAHL, we had to tell the database if we wanted it to search narrower terms below. So in that way, we would explode it. In PubMed, it's automatically exploded, and if we do not want it to explode, then we have to check this box. Below that, we'll see entry terms. So this is telling me that whenever you enter, say, breakthrough bleeding, it would map to this term. Dysfunctional uterine bleeding mapped to this term. So that's how it works with the automatic term mapping. And then if I look to see it in the mesh tree, I can see metrorrhagia is a narrower heading of uterine hemorrhage, which is what happened when we use the automatic term mapping. So I have to ask myself, do I want this narrower heading or do I want the uterine hemorrhage? So let's click on that. It's hyperlinked. And then I can read this definition, which is, as expected, broader, but it doesn't mention anything about being abnormal. So I'm thinking I want the narrower term. So I can just go back and hyperlink to it. Add it to the search builder. And I can run a search. Now, I can use Boolean operators in this database, so I can OR in keywords if I'd like, because when I search directly from the mesh headings index, the automatic term mapping stops. So I'm going to go ahead and enter in additional phrases. So I'm going to go ahead and enter abnormal uterine bleeding. or dysfunctional uterine bleeding. Notice that my booleans are in capital letters. That's required in this database. I do not use truncation in this database. It's not recommended. So I'm doing a subject search and keyword searches. And if I look below, you'll see that the automatic term mapping didn't work because I chose the heading right from the headings index. It didn't do the automatic term mapping. That shuts off. Then I can proceed through the process with my other terms. I don't always put in all of my PICO terms. Sometimes I just start with the P and the I. But let's look at partial hysterectomy. When I scroll down, I see that hysterectomy is actually the mesh term. So what I'm thinking is I'm just going to enter that as my term. So what I probably will want to do is go through my results, look at my abstracts, and see if it defines if it's partial, because there is no definition in the mesh headings for partial hysterectomy. So I'm putting in hysterectomy and I'm running a search. And now it's running it as a mesh term and also as a keyword. And I'm scrolling back up and I'm going to do endometrial ablation. Oops. And I do want my comparison in there, so I'm going to look down. And it maps to this term endometrial ablation techniques. I won't go through the process again, but I looked it up in Mesh and I confirmed that that is the correct heading. Then I'm going to go to our advanced search. This will look familiar to those of you who viewed the search history when we were doing the Synol taping. So if you watch that video, you know what I'm talking about. So I'm going to go ahead and add in my terms all together and combine them with an AND. So I'm going to start with my P concept. I want to add in my I. I wanted to go broader for that. And then I'm going to add in my C. So I've ANDed them together now. And they've also been building up here in this search box. I'm going to show you something in a moment, so I'm going to suggest that we copy this first. So I'm going to do a Control C, and I have it in my clipboard there. But I'm going to run a search. And I got 240 results. Now, I'm going to take you back out to the Pubmed homepage, pubmed.gov. I want to show you this clinical queries limiter. I'm going to put my search terms in here. And I'm going to run a search. And what this does is it actually searches by question type. And it also searches and breaks out systematic reviews. So now my search results are broken out. I can have a therapy, etiology, diagnosis, prognosis question. So this is a therapy question. And I can have it search broadly or narrow. I'm going to go with broad. And if I want to see all the results, I scroll down and I click See All. And that's one way to narrow search results down to potentially study designs that would be used for a therapy question. Now, if I really wanted to get very, very specific, I can use article types limiters on the side. Look at article types. Look at customize. There are a whole host of article types. To bring one to the forefront, like practice guideline, I select it and I click show. And now it appears in my list. But it's not applied until you actually click on it. So if I want to apply the randomized control trial limiter, I click on it. If I want to look at something within the last 5 years, I click on it. Okay, and you can also do a custom range if you want to. Under additional filters, there are ones for age, there are ones for gender, language. If you want to see any of those, you just select them and click Show. And then you can apply. Within the last 5 years, this is the only one that comes up. When I look at it, I want just to get you familiar with a record here. Let's explode this author information so I can see what their affiliation is. So I see the authors, I see their affiliations. I also see the journal that it was in. So I showed you in the last video how to go ahead and look those up because they are in this type of abbreviation so that you can understand the citation. So if you haven't watched that, you'll want to watch that. Here is my abstract, and then I can go ahead and read it and see if it actually applies to answer my question. You can look here at the keywords that were used. And if I look below, here are the mesh terms that were used. And so if you do find articles that you like, just like you did in CINAHL, look to the mesh terms and see if it used any type of heading. If you weren't able to find one, or it's not mapping the way you think it should have, this is another way to look at appropriate mesh terms. To get this full text, I'm going to go up to the top, and it asks me to link out to Elsevier. Let's see if we can get the full text. Now it's not giving me the option for 360 link, but sometimes I do see it there. And that's something that I really want to bring to your attention. Usually if we go through the library database, we'll see something like that 360 link here. If you don't see it, then take the Journal of Minimally Invasive Gynecology and go to our journal finder, which I showed you in the last video. Go there and look it up if you can't get the full text here. That's true of anything you can't get the full text for. And so this will happen a lot when you're searching particularly pubmed.gov directly. That doesn't mean we don't have it. The way we got to the clinical queries was via the PubMed homepage. Another way to get to the clinical queries is to use the drop-down under More Resources on the Advanced Search page and select Clinical Queries. You can enter your search terms, again, the same in the box. But I wanted to show you something about those filters. If I click on Filter Information, you can see what we call hedges. Those are pre-built search strings that are added onto your search terms. So we searched therapy broad. You can see that it added terms like clinical trial, random allocation. The difference between that and narrow was we're just looking at randomized controlled trials. When I did the broad search, I had more results. And when I added on the randomized controlled trial limiter, then we only ended up with the one result. Well, you might want to take that off and go back and look and see what the other broad results were. We might want to ask ourselves, when we're looking at not getting many, maybe a lot have not been done on this particular topic. Maybe it's new, or maybe it's old. Maybe it's been done and we've moved on. So, we don't know what we're going to find until we actually do the search, but I'm always trying to analyze it and think about ways in which I can both improve the search with my keywords, my subject headings, and then see what's happening in the literature, do a little bit of reading. Now I want to scroll down to etiology, and I had mentioned when we were talking in CINAHL, I had mentioned that the word cohort doesn't appear as a publication type, and it doesn't here either. So you notice they're adding the term in to the etiology search. And so that's how it's retrieving those. So whether you're doing a search and you're adding it in or you're using a hedge, that's how it's getting into your result set. So I hope this makes the hedges a little clearer for you. I wanted to emphasize to people that, as I'm searching and making decisions on subject headings and keywords, that I always need to go back and revise based on the results that I get and also from my reading, what I'm seeing, terminology being used in the literature, and what I'm also learning. So, as I was reading and learning, I thought perhaps it would have been better if I had used the broader heading for my AUB concept. So I used the broader heading uterine hemorrhage. And add it to my search builder. I'm going to run a search. And we know it's searching the narrower headings below because I didn't tell it not to. So I'm going to add abnormal uterine bleeding or dysfunctional and I'm going to run a search. Because I've saved my searches, because I used my search history to combine individual concepts, they're all there in my search history. So if I go to my advanced search, I don't have to key everything all over again. I can just start with my condition, which I've revised with the new subject heading, and then just add in my intervention and my comparison quite easily, and then do a search. And then go ahead and reapply my limiters. I can use the clinical queries if I wanted to, but I could also just target randomized controlled trials. And then you'll see when you add that date limiter, it shrinks it incredibly down to 2, which I will have to read because this is a broader search, read the abstracts to see if they actually apply to my particular patient in answering my question. I just can't say enough that this is the process of research, and I don't want anyone to think that there's a magic search that if they ask me, I will find it. These are the processes that I go through, so this is what you should expect to do. I also want to show you how to import to RefWorks from Pubmed. It's a little different than from CINAHL, which does a direct export, but what you want to do is select the articles you want. And in this case, I thought this review article would be very good to get a sense of the role of this procedure because it's a newer publication date. So I'm going to send this up here in the upper right, send to Citation Manager, and create a file. And then I'm going to save as, give it a name I can recognize. And this is my second try at this, so I'm going to put AUB2. And now it's in my downloads. And then what you need to do is go to RefWorks, as I showed you in the previous video. Once you're in RefWorks, you're going to have to go over References and now Import. Now, this may not default for you to NLM Pubmed, so use the drop-down and select it. And then the database is Pubmed. Now you choose your file that you saved. And import. And now you see that article is in my RefWorks. All I need to do is move it into my folder. And we created one last time for Nursing 607. Okay, so that's how you use RefWorks when you're using Pubmed. You can also save your Pubmed searches in your NCBI account. From the Pubmed homepage, in the blue menu bar on the far right, sign in to NCBI. If you don't have an account, in the sign-in box at the very bottom is a link to register for an account, or just go ahead and sign in. And once you're signed in, you can select your advanced search to get your search history. If you click on the search ID number, it allows you to save it in your NCBI. You can give it a new search name, but I'm going to let it be the actual search string. And I'm going to save it. If I go up to my NCBI, there's my saved search, and I can select it, rerun it. And that's how you save searches in Pubmed. This concludes our exploration of Pubmed. Next, we'll turn our attention to Medline EBSCO. Hi everyone, I'm back on the library homepage and I'm selecting the OneSearch tab, databases A through Z again, so that I can get to Medline. Medline, the EBSCO version. So this looks very similar, this interface, as all the EBSCO interfaces look like this. So it looked like CINAHL, but it's telling me it's searching Medline. And you'll notice in the blue menu bar that it no longer says CINAHL headings, it says MESH 2018. That's because the headings indexes are unique to each database, and Medline uses MESH. Let's click on it. And now let's browse for our term, abnormal uterine bleeding. And you'll notice this looks very similar once again to the layout we had in CINAHL, and it also operates the same. So we browse for our term and we retrieve a set of results that it's suggesting. When we want to understand what the meaning of the heading is, we look at the scope note. This is the broader heading, and so this is the same definition that we saw in Pubmed. It's the same mesh heading. And here again, it tells me this narrower term in that this abnormal bleeding does not relate to menstruation. So you have to look at your question, but then you have to look at your patient, and say, well, which applies here? So in my imaginary scenario, this definition applied. So I chose the narrower term because there was one available. I'm going to click on the term so that you can see the mesh tree. And the layout, once again, is very similar to the CINAHL tree. If I select a heading, it explodes so that I can see this subheadings menu now. And I can select one, and I can also read the scope note for the subheadings. If you're worried about choosing one, don't. On your first pass around, I would not choose any. If you had too many results, I might think about going back and choosing a subheading like maybe prevention and control, depending on your question. Now, you can explode a term so that you search the broader heading and the narrower headings below. In this index, even though it's still mesh, in this EBSCO version, it works the same as the CINAHL headings. You have to tell it to explode. It doesn't automatically explode. So if you want it to, and I were to explode uterine hemorrhage, I would get uterine hemorrhage, metrorrhagia, and menorrhagia because they are the narrower headings below it. For this pass, I don't want to do that, so I'm just selecting my single heading. And I don't want it to be a major concept, even though it might seem like it should be. Again, this just narrows your results set so that it would have to be a major heading. I just don't check it. So looking at this search box, I want to make sure I have the terms I want in there. And I'm going to search the database. Now you could do this for each and every concept the same as we did when we searched Pubmed and when we searched CINAHL. So if I were to do this like last time, I did my subject heading search, then I ordered in all my other keywords. I went to the next concept, my intervention, I put in the subject heading, I looked it up, I ran a search, I put in my keywords. I go ahead, I did it for my third concept, and then what I did was I clicked on the search history. And when I did that, what I do is I select the separate searches and then I search them with an AND. So to go back, these are ORed together. ORed together. These are ORed together. I had to change the default and make it OR. Then I used my search history, separate different concepts, and now I ANDed them together. I had an inquiry from a student. Why could she not go ahead and just OR all her terms in one line? And you can. You could do it something like this, where each concept is on a separate line and you AND them together. Now, here's my subject heading term. And as I go through and I look at it, there's all my ORed terms. So how do I look at it? Well, I'm using the directional arrows on my keypad, but it is kind of messy to see. And if you had a spelling error or you wanted to go back and truncate, it's a little more awkward than if you had put them all on a separate line and did your search history to combine later. Also consider this. If you're going to enter them with 3 different boxes, ANDing together your different concepts, if you do a search on a subject heading, when you go back to find another subject heading and you search it, it just runs another search. So now your old terms are no longer in there. What you would have to do is look this up and then key it in manually with the prefix. I think it's easier for me to use my search history. I don't lose anything. I can manipulate things better. But if you're more comfortable with this, then by all means do this. So I'm going to run this search. And on our left-hand side, we have the same basic limiters we see in all the EBSCO databases. And we don't want to limit to full text because we can enter library loan. We could choose a pub date range to get within those 5 years. And we want to use our language limiters always to limit to English. But let's take a look at the show more. This is unique to each database. The interface looks similar. Contents are different. But you have a clinical queries limiter here as well as you did in CINAHL. It won't be here for every database. Now, just like CINAHL, it has 3 levels: high sensitivity, high specificity, and best balance. You didn't have that in Pubmed. You had broad and narrow. So sensitivity would be very much like broad. And we don't have a separate randomized control trial like we did in CINAHL, but we can find one in the publication types. So we could also apply a randomized control trial. Be aware you don't want to run these 2 limiters simultaneously because the randomized control trial will supersede everything else that the broad limiter would pick up. So examine your therapy search and then maybe apply a date limiter. And then if you want to, go back and apply the randomized control trial limiter. You could go back and apply that randomized control trial limiter. You can also find practice guidelines, and we can find meta-analysis, and we can find systematic reviews. At first glance, it looked like we got a lot more RCTs when we applied it in this database, but we didn't apply the date limiter yet. Once I do that, you'll see that we're back down to 1 result. And this isn't much of a surprise because we are still searching basically the same database. It's a different interface. But this result tells me that there were a lot of RCTs run prior to the last 5 years, not within the last 5 years. This is what I have to look at. So examine your results, learn from your results, revise your searches. When you're confident you've exhausted a database, try another database. You may learn something new and go back to the previous database. And do what's best for you. If you prefer Pubmed, search Pubmed. If you prefer to use the EBSCO Medline interface, use that interface. If you want to search your PICO concepts separately and then combine them with your search history, do that. If you prefer to run them all at once, then it's your pleasure. Whatever you prefer. Good luck with your searching.